It was just last year, or just last August, that American President Donald Trump, that's my president, said the following statement: "People are dying. It is what it is." Well, it is what it is. What an odd statement for a leader to make at a time when the pandemic had already killed 150,000 Americans. But what I'd like to talk about today is my belief that President Trump might have unintentionally spoken some wise words. It is what it is true, because in the pandemic, we follow the laws of nature. And so what I'd like to do today is to try to explain about how this works. So the pandemic that we have today is a interaction between a virus and a human. The virus is a tiny piece of RNA, protein, and fats that are tiny and terribly unimportant, except they have one particular job that they're able to do. They're able to enter into our body, attach to our cells, take over our cellular machinery, make more copies of themselves, and expel them so they can continue the cycle. That's what it is. What will be is the part, part has to do with the system, how the system exists in the natural world, how the system is governed by the natural laws of physics and chemistry. It is what it is. And what I'd like to suggest is it is what it is might also apply to climate change as well. It is a system, and it's a system where we have added large amounts of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And what's going to happen is the greenhouse gases are going to trap heat and inevitably going to lead to an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide, or increase the temperature and have adverse effects on the global climate. So the SARS CoV-2 virus was a novel virus. That means this is the first time it's interacted with humans. So what do we do when we're faced with an unknown enemy? Where can we turn for help? And the answer is there's only one place to turn: science to the rescue. And what we've seen in the last few months is science working overtime to try to solve these problems. We've learned a great deal about science from this. But what I'd like to do today is to introduce what I think is the most important point that I want all of you to learn. And that is, science doesn't care. Science doesn't care if their answers suggest that we have problems ahead. Science doesn't care if the answers go against your political beliefs or your religious beliefs. Science doesn't care, because it is what it is. And so for much of my professional career, I've been involved in science education. And all of my activities have been guided by one simple notion, which is all that's required is for me to present understandable, accessible information. And if I give that to people, they should now have the knowledge and the motivation to make informed decisions. Clearly, that's been a very, very naive assumption on my part. Clearly, we have failed massively. And we know that the global climate change, we've been having this discussion for decades, and still we've not made the proper actions. So we have to figure out a better way. What can we do to move forward? So I suggest now that it's time that the scientists and educators start learning from our colleagues in the field of psychology. They've been studying for some time how factors such as the Dunning-Kruger effect, how factors such as cognitive dissonance cause people to make poor decisions. It should not at all be surprising that people are actually sometimes pretty bad at making good decisions. And what we really need to understand is how tightly people will hold to their ideas, even when you present them, and sometimes because you present them with better information. And they will especially hold tightly to this information when they feel like either their team or their tribe has been threatened. So we need to understand how to take that into effect. So before I moved to Hong Kong, I was a professor at Texas Tech University. That's in Lubbock, Texas, which is a small city surrounded by cotton fields in the western part of the state of Texas. Lubbock definitely falls in this Bible Belt in the United States. And Lubbock residents were very proud to claim that they had the highest number of churches per capita of any city in the United States. And while I was there, Lubbock was chosen as the second most conservative city in the United States. So you can imagine that someone like me teaching evolutionary biology and environmental science in an environment that was full of evangelical Christians and conservative Republicans, that was quite a challenge. So the university sponsored many events related to climate change. And at the end of the talk, there was always someone from the local community. I'm going to call him Angry Guy. And what Angry Guy would do is come up, and when it's his chance to answer the question, Angry Guy would come up to the front and he would say, why is it that all of those darn atheist, democratic, socialist scientists from California always talk about these crazy ideas? Now, I would have no idea how to respond to Angry Man, but we had a colleague at Texas Tech who was able to respond to him perfectly. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is a climate scientist who is a professor and the head of the climate science unit at Texas Tech University. She was also a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So she has the credentials to go and talk about science anywhere in the world. But she carries different credentials that allowed her to be so effective to speak to Angry Guy. So after Angry Guy gives his talk, she looks at him very calmly and she says, well, I'm from Canada, so I can't vote in your elections, but I am rather conservative, and it's pretty likely that I would vote for a Republican candidate. And even more, I'm a Christian. And in fact, I'm married to a Christian pastor. And we're both quite concerned about global climate change, and we're so concerned that we've written a book together. And what I'd like to do now is to invite you to come and let me share my ideas about why we should care about climate change. And watching the Angry Man deflate as he realized he's now talking to someone who is speaking his language. He was expecting to be having an argument with some kind of outsider egghead, and instead he's talking to someone who speaks his own language. And what happens is, because they have this common ground, now the opportunity is there for real learning to take place. So I watched the spread of the pandemic with great concern here in Hong Kong as it spread across the US, getting disappointed by the ever worsening data, and even more disappointed by the action, or rather lack of action, of the of government officials at various levels in the US. But I have to admit, I am a typical American. So in my experience, the only people that wore face masks were doctors, nurses, and bank robbers. It was totally unfamiliar to me to wear a mask until the pandemic came and I started it doing every day. So I understand the feeling of the people back in the US. And so I spend a lot of time on Facebook because that's how I communicate with my friends and family around the world. And what I've been able to do is to follow along and watch the discussions that started in Texas about should we wear masks or should we not wear masks. And on occasions then I would chime in and talk something about my experience in Hong Kong, and it appeared that people were interested. I didn't make a big post about it until June 19th. And June 19th was an interesting day. That was the day when the that was the day when the total number of cases that had been detected in Lubbock, Texas, a city of a population of 300,000, exceeded the number of cases that had been found in Hong Kong. At that time, the death toll in Lubbock, Texas was 15 times greater than the death toll here in Hong Kong. And what I found is people were quite interested in reading that. People made comments. People shared it with their other friends, and I was even talked about on the rock and roll radio station in town. And one of the fun things about Facebook is you can kind of lurk in the background and you can see where the conversations are going. And so I was able to do that. And what I noticed is anytime anyone shared my opinion, they always did it with sort of this statement. They said, "Mark's my friend," or they said, "He's my old professor." And then they would say, "He's an okay guy. He used to work at Texas Tech. Take a listen to what he has to say about Hong Kong." And so what happened was people were listening. Thousands of people for one day were listening to what I said, not because I was brilliant and insightful, but instead because it was a message coming from an insider who had gotten the approval of their friends. So I was very pleased to be invited to join in this activity today, and my hope was to give an inspiring, optimistic speech. But unfortunately, recent events have caused me to lose a bit of my optimism. In just the last week in Lubbock, Texas, population 300,000 people, the total number of people that have been confirmed to have the virus in the last 7 days is over 1,600 people. That's over 230 people each day, and over 16 people have died. This is occurring in a city that you would think has many advantages. The city is geographically isolated from other locations. The city is home to a major university and to a health science center, a medical school as well. Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is there, who is perhaps the most qualified person in the world to discuss about these kinds of issues with the local people. And they also had the benefit of my brilliant Facebook posts. How could things have gone so wrong? And what can we learn from this so that we don't make the same mistakes when we start focusing more clearly on climate change? So thankfully, I see things in Hong Kong that I think we can be confident about. As an outsider, I can notice things about Hong Kong, advantages that you have that you may not recognize. And in particular, I think that your small size, the very high population density, and the way that the social and family structure works, there tends to be a lot of threads connecting people throughout the community. There's a big network that joins people in Hong Kong, and we need to be taking advantage of that network if we're going to educate people properly. The other big advantage that they have in Hong Kong is that you learned from history. It's clear that SARS had an important effect on you, and that the response of people in this pandemic was strongly driven by your experience from the past. And one of the exciting things to see in Hong Kong is immediately when the pandemic started, who started going on TV and talking? It was the scientists. And people were listening to the scientists and were showing great respect for the scientists. And what I hope is you also have equally good climate scientists here in Hong Kong. So what I hope is we're able to take that appreciation of science and the scientific approach and the need to use science to project about what's going to happen in the future. I hope we can convert that from interest in only believing the medical people and transfer that to the climate scientists as well. So I never met Angry Guy in Lubbock, Texas, but I assume that he loves his kids and his grandkids and he wants them to have a good future. I may know some of the people in Lubbock, Texas that today are being the super spreaders because they're not wearing their masks and they're not social distancing. But I don't think they're bad people. I don't think they're intentionally trying to harm others. I just think they're behaving ignorantly. And I know here in Hong Kong, it doesn't matter. Hong Kong people, regardless of your political persuasion, they want the pandemic to end. They want it to end on a positive note, and we don't want to do anything that's going to cause the environment to change such that our future generations will be harmed. So, unfortunately, it is what it is. And science tells us that if we don't act now, that the temperature is going to increase and the climate will change. That's just a fact. And I realize I need to recognize that. And recognizing that doesn't make me pessimistic. It makes me instead realistic. And what we need to do is we all need to be realistic now because we have a very important choice we need to make. We can either decide that we are going to act today and we're going to act now and we're going to act in a significant way to try to limit the change in the climate, or we're going to decide that we'll put off that action for some time in the future until the damage is already done, people are already starting to suffer. Whether we act now or act later, action is going to be required. And so I've been very impressed by the interaction that I've seen today. This group gives me some increase in my optimism. I know which direction you're going to choose. We're going to start trying to make sure that people are acting now. So I'd like to thank you for giving me a little bit of hope when I most needed it, and to say thank you and good luck.